Boys and girls, recess is over, so get to your seats and pay attention. It's a thrill to see this good crowd out today. You're really in for a treat. Special thanks to First Alabama Bank for sponsoring this Sentimental Journey series. Today we are in for a wonderful treat. We're welcoming Ruth Cook, who is bringing the story to life in the Marble Quarry Village, company town, at the edge of the Big Hole, or whatever memories they have about it. And she spent more time and effort working on this book that she printed, The Magic in Stone, which is a Sylacauga marble story published in 2019. And it's a definitive history of Sylacauga marble. So the important thing is that she spent all this time studying, and she also spent a lot of time in looking at the life of mining marble and how it comes about. And what I like about her is that not only did she do a good job with this book, but she continues to carry this story throughout the state and throughout the Southeast. I know I get inquiries off of Mobile and Montgomery and Archives and History and the people in West Alabama and East Alabama and all over. So she has just done a wonderful thing, but she has done just about the entire Shelby and Jefferson County area, all the study clubs. So she has a lot of information, and there'll be question and answer times at the end. We didn't just find her. She had already done a program here for the Brown Bag before, north across the river, which was the true story and arrest of and deportation of several hundred Georgia people who got sent somewhere else during the Civil War. And absolutely best thing that has happened from World War II is Guess Behind Barbed Wire, which is the story of the German prisoner of war camp in Aliceville. And she's just absolutely the most wonderful thing, cooperative and helpful. And one thing about it, Ruth, if you do a good job today, we'll start a process of adopting you. So let's welcome Ruth Cook, and a future citizen of Sylacauga. Ruth?
Thank you, Ted. Thank you, Ted. Can y'all hear me? Okay, good. It's nice to be back in Sylacauga, and I really appreciate this opportunity to share again a little bit of we're going to take a journey back in time through Gantt's Quarry today, and I'm going to do it a little bit differently. Instead of telling you in my words, I've gone back and collected the words of people who grew up in Gantt's Quarry and people who worked in Gantt's Quarry or had their families there, and I'm going to share their words with you. Now, obviously, you're going to have to use your imagination a little bit because I don't sound like these people. But it's their words that I'm going to be sharing with you today. And I have paraphrased a little bit here and there just to make it smoother. But I think you'll find this interesting. And as he said, we'll have a little Q&A at the end. I've also left the names out, so you get to guess who said what. And you're welcome to comment on that at the end. So if I can make this, let me see, I gotta make sure it works. Yeah. Okay, so I'm gonna go into this little journey through Gantt's Quarry, and I hope you enjoy it, okay? So, first off, now this is not the whistle at the quarry, but you can imagine that it is, okay? In Gantt's Quarry, the company whistle blew for work to start and for lunch and for going home. When I was a child and that whistle blew at lunchtime, no matter where I was in the village, I knew I could eat. Anybody's house. It didn't matter. It was a family community. Everyone who ever lived in Gantt's Quarry remembers how that whistle blew when they were getting ready to dynamite down in the hole. They'd sound 3 whistle blasts, and that was your 5-minute warning to clear the area. And then there were 5 there was a 5-whistle reveille right before the big boom, and finally one long blast for all clear when it was all over. They always blasted in the afternoon, after school was out. We knew we had 5 minutes, but we didn't go running inside. We just knew to look out for the rocks. The marble would fly when they dynamited. Sometimes we'd see it flying up, falling back, but mostly it didn't come close to us. If I was caddying out on the golf course, though, when that whistle blew, I had to go find a tree or a shed to hide under, to get away from the debris. Now, my family lived for a while right out on the edge of that hole. It was loud there, and it was dusty. And when that whistle blew in the late afternoon for the dynamite, I'd hurry to get in the house, and I'd get my kids inside too, because sometimes the chips and the Scrabble landed right in our own yard. Sometimes that whistle blew a special way to indicate there was a fire. And when that happened, the men who were working in the quarry or in the shop dropped everything and went right to whatever house needed help. Usually they were able to save many, many things. There were a lot of house fires in Gantt's Quarry because everything out there was heart pine. Our duplex burned to the ground in 1947. I still have the 2-page list of contributions that 70 of our neighbors, 70 neighbors and friends, collected to help us after that fire. The amounts ranged from 50 cents to $10, and there were even $3.53 from my classmates at the Quarry School. We stayed at first with our neighbors, and then with relatives out on the Quarry Road. And then we had this tiny shack that looked like a boxcar with a porch on the front. But my parents made it comfortable. And later, we moved into a new house with windows that lifted up and hooked. Do you remember those? Now, during World War II, that whistle, this one, sometimes blew to signal air raid drills. My father was in charge of that. He wore a hard hat, and if I asked him when he thought the next drill was going to be, he'd say importantly, you think I'd tell you? He was the only person in Gantt's Quarry who knew when that next air raid drill was going to be, and sometimes it was even 2 o'clock in the morning. But just before he blew the whistle, he'd get on the telephone and he'd call certain men in the village to go to their positions. And they would do that, and then they'd call him back when all the lights were out in Gantt's Quarry. Now, my dad worked down in the hole. He ran the broach machine that drilled the holes where they put the dynamite to break out the big chunks. It took 2 men, and you can see right here, it took 2 men, and they'd be hanging off the side of the rock on the apparatus that held the drilling machine. You can see it there. That was considered dangerous even back then. OSHA would never allow what was going on out at the quarry back then. When my dad and his partner got deeper down, spring water would rush into the quarry, and they'd have to keep a pump running 24 hours a day. Now, my father, is another man, worked at Alabama Marble Company for 41 years. That was the only job he ever had. He was the dynamite shooter. He did the explosions, and he blew up the marble. Now, my father worked in the finishing shop. They had saws that would cut the marble off into slabs, and then they'd shine and polish one side of it. Those overhead saws worked their way back and forth 24 hours a day. You could hear them from our house, but they weren't that loud, and we got used to it. At the end of a shift, there would be marble dust everywhere, and those who worked in that shop would come out white as a sheet of paper, just covered from head to toe with marble dust. They had a huge air hose outside the finishing shop, and they'd take that air hose and blow the marble dust off of each other. And then they'd walk into the bathhouse, take a shower, put on a clean pair of overalls, and go home. I remember as a boy thinking, I don't want to work in that finishing shop, because every single day they all come out looking like somebody dumped a bag of flour right over their heads. Now, the Alabama Marble Company had its own railroad tracks, and they ran from the edge of the hole to the finishing shop and then out to the edge of the property. My dad and another man ran the dinky engine. You can see the two of them there. Ran the dinky engine that hooked up the carloads of marble, pulled them out to the main tracks, and then switched those cars off to the L&N engine to deliver for delivery to buyers. When those cars were empty, though, they'd let us schoolboys and girls, as you see here, get on and ride back down to the shop. Now, our father was a millwright, so he was in charge of maintenance at Gantt's Quarry for many, many years. And when he got news that the number so-and-so saw was down, he'd hurry off to fix it right away. And sometimes I got to go with him. I can still remember the smell when those saws cut the big slabs with the water and the sand cascading down over them. Now, the company electrician and plumber fixed stuff all over the village, and he had two fluffy Spitz dogs that rode around with him in his truck. Now, here's where your imagination comes in. I couldn't find a picture anywhere of Spitz dogs in a truck, so here you are. If he stayed too long at one job, though, as the story goes, those dogs would jump up and beat the horn for him to hurry up. Sometimes, right before the holidays, he'd give one of the young boys in town a couple dollars to climb up to the top of the village water tower and install new light bulbs on the Christmas star. Now, everybody in Gantt's Quarry knew my uncle because he did so many different things for both the marble company and the community. He was an accomplished brick mason and a plasterer, but he also drove the company truck, and he'd pick up trash and deliver coal to people's yards for the winter. And then on the weekends, after World War II, my uncle would get the back of that truck all cleaned out, and then he'd go over to our schoolhouse and load up 4 or 5 wooden benches in the back. And if the Gantt's Quarry Q baseball team had an away game on Saturday, he'd drive the whole team to Wilsonville or Talladega or Childersburg or wherever they were going to play. And then on Sunday morning, he'd load up the back of the truck again and drive many of the black children who lived in Gantt's Quarry out the Fayetteville Road for Sunday school at a church in Cedar Creek. Now, this may look familiar depending on your background. Unlike the company stores made historically famous by Tennessee Ernie Ford's 1955 song, 16 Tons. Remember that? 16 tons, you load 16 tons, and what do you get? Another day older and deeper in debt. The Alabama Marble Company, however, their mercantile store and Ezekiel's store did not charge inflated prices or unreasonable interest. They sold everything from hog feed to ice cream, plus the rubber boots and shovels and other things needed for work. At both of these stores, the employees were allowed to buy on credit, but then they could have the balance deducted from their cash envelope on payday. They did not owe their souls to the company store. And that's the mercantile that you see up there on the left. I can still see that mercantile building, one level, long and narrow, with a pitched roof and a little front porch. I used to send my son over there with a note, maybe for a loaf of bread and a jar of milk, and the note would tell him to let him pick out a treat for himself, too. And my boy would always tell them he needed 2 treats, one for his sister at home, too. Now, they didn't have all their meat wrapped up in cellophane like they do these days. You'd ask for a half a pound of bologna, and they'd hold up a 2-foot stick of it and shave it off, just what you asked for. I loved my daddy's Friday paydays because I got to go over to the store with him so he could pay whatever he owed and start a new tab. And then after that, I'd get a candy bar or a popsicle. Quarry people were known as the best kinds of creditors in the area. And at Ezekiel's, we found that to be true. People came directly to our store and paid their tab on payday because they wanted to always be able to get more groceries. We never had to go and stand outside the pay window to get what they owed. Our store had marble countertops, and they were white and creamy, just like the ones we had at home. One day, the Roll-Aid salesman came in with a delivery. Now, he already understood that Roll-Aid's products have GCC, which is ground calcium carbonate, that's marble ground up. He already understood that that's primarily what Roll-Aids were. But he came into the store that day, and he came up to the counter with kind of a puzzled look on his face. And he said to me, ma'am, how'd they pack all that marble dust back together and press it down like that to make a countertop? Well, I just laughed and told him he had it backwards. Now, if Alabama marble employees owed their souls to anybody, like the song says, it was more likely to be to Sylacauga and Birmingham loan sharks who parked their shiny black cars outside the company payroll office window and stood around under a large shade tree waiting to grab first cut from those cash-filled envelopes on payday. In 1947, some of us employees joined a union, and some did not. And that winter, there was a strike for better pay and union representation. Us union employees stood our picket line 24 hours a day for several weeks, and we huddled around fire pots when the weather was freezing. The non-union employees continued to cross the picket line, walked up the road past the post office and the company store, and did their jobs. In the end, the company was able to keep the union out, but I still believe the strike did some good. I told the men who worked for me that I was proud of their effort. And when it was all over, those who'd gone out on strike were called into the company offices and told they could return to their jobs. All except the 4 men who were believed to have started the strike. They were fired. Now, the post office was the focal point of our village from the very beginning, but the original 1905 building was just one room, really, was blown totally away in that awful 1932 tornado that killed 15 people in Gantt's Quarry. It was a devastation, and for days afterwards, folks kept finding letters and packages lodged up in trees or scattered throughout the surrounding woods. After that tornado, a small white frame building, the one you see over there on the right, that had been a doctor's office, was transformed into our new post office. This one had a front porch and 2 additional rooms. One became the village library, and the other continued to serve as an office for visiting doctors. Most of us visited that post office every single day to check for mail. When I was a child, most days I took an afternoon walk around town with my mother. We'd stop by this house and that, and one nice lady always gave me a sugar cube or an apple so I could treat a mule named Belle. An old hound dog usually followed us up to the post office, and from there we'd go by my grandfather's office at the Quarry and get an ice cold Coca-Cola. The lady postmistress from 1944 through 1971 knew everybody in Gantt's Quarry. She could show a visitor exactly where any one of us lived. And the clerk who worked with her most of the time could do the same. Church activities were a big part of life in Gantt's Quarry, too. Unlike some company towns in the early 20th century, Quarry residents could choose their own religious practices, and they didn't have to pay pew taxes to support a company church. Now, none of us have been able to find any photographs of the Gantt's Quarry Methodist Church, but we do remember it well. Its first building, including a brand new classroom annex, had to be rebuilt after that 1932 tornado. The new building went up on the original location right next to the Quarry School. I remember that it was down a little pathway, kind of back in the woods compared to the rest of town. It always reminded me of that song about the little brown church in the wildwood, except that ours was white frame. My mother and I cleaned that church every week for a while when I was a child. I had 2 little dogs that would come with us, and they'd sniff around under the pews and try to chew off the gum that people stuck there. A new Methodist preacher arrived in 1945, and he was a bit of a celebrity. His son, who had originally followed his father's footsteps to study for the ministry at Birmingham Southern, ended up doing a comedy spot on the National Barn Dance radio broadcast, where he shared a mic with performers like Red Foley and George Goebel. Remember those guys? Later, this son of a preacher man became Gene Autry's sidekick on TV. As I recall, the Methodists in Gantt's Quarry followed the career very closely of their pastor's son. As early as 1917, Gantt's Quarry also had a small Methodist church attended by its black residents. And again, no picture to be found. But a Reverend Shelburne preached there on Sundays, and other families in that community attended services over in the Cedar Creek community. Now, the Gantt's Quarry Baptist Church was founded in a school classroom in 1910, and it opened its own building, the one that you see here, in 1914. But by the 1950s, the quarry was beginning to gobble up land for expansion, closer and closer and closer to their church. So the congregation decided to pack up, and move out to the Quarry Road. And there's an interesting story about the marble in that new church that they built out there. The trustees wanted local marble in the new church, just like they had in the old one. But they had a very tight budget. So they presented their plan to the Alabama Marble Company and asked for a price estimate. They wanted to know what it would cost. Weeks and weeks went by, though, and they didn't hear anything. And then one day, somebody called from the quarry and said the marble for the new Baptist church was ready. Well, those trustees were kind of worried. They didn't know what the price was and if they could afford it. So a couple of them drove out to the quarry and explained to the owners that they had only asked for a price estimate. Well, your marble's ready, the owner said, and all it takes to pay for it is a prayer. So right then and there, those trustees knelt down and offered a quick prayer of thanksgiving. And soon after that, their marble was delivered. Now that's the kind of stuff you don't always hear about, you know? That quarry owner was a devout Catholic, and it speaks a lot about how the people who had developed Gantt's Quarry interacted with each other. I mean, everybody truly was a family. There was a Catholic presence among the owners and employees at Gantt's Quarry from the beginning. For many years, though, Mass was celebrated only once a year in the village itself, and the visiting priest from St. Bernard's Abbey would preside in somebody's living room. And then in the 1930s and 1940s, Mass was celebrated 3 or 4 times a year in the village, and it was often very, very early on Sunday morning because the Methodist Church would open its doors early for them to have their services. Or the school would open up on Sunday, so they could use the auditorium there. Lost my place, sorry. In 1949, when most quarry residents had cars, St. Jude's opened in time for Easter in Sylacauga. And as you can see here on the right, much of the interior of that church also had a lot of marble from Gantt's Quarry. Now, to get to our school, a whole bunch of us lived close together, and we walked together. We'd cut across right below Ezekiel's store, go up by the railroad tracks, and out by the crusher. We had to cross a creek. I lost my place again. We had to cross the creek on a foot log, and nearly every morning, somebody fell in that creek. Then we walked past a huge persimmon tree in the yard of the Methodist Church, right next to the school. And in the fall, when that orange fruit was ripe and at its stickiest, we thought it was great fun, morning and afternoon, to bombard each other with those sticky persimmons. We had great meals at our school. Our 2 lunchroom ladies would bring stuff from their freezers at home and make the best vegetable soup and cornbread. And we all knew they couldn't be making very much money because they were always letting some child go through the line without paying. "Oh, we cook too much today," they'd say. "Would you mind eating what's left?" A highlight of every school year was the May Day celebration. Our mothers made crepe paper costumes for us, white paper dresses sewn on cloth bodices for the girls, and wide-collared paper smocks for the boys to make them look like court jesters. Can you imagine how much they must have enjoyed that? Then we'd dance around the maypole with our teacher, intertwining the colorful streamers. Because during the times we are remembering here, segregation was still the law in Alabama. There was a separate school for the black children who grew up in Gantt's Quarry. Also built in 1917, it was a 2-room school. Out in front was a big bell swinging on a stand. Somebody would ring that bell for school to start, and then again later to signal for recess. On really cold days, our parents took turns going over to the school very early to get the potbelly stove going so the classrooms would be warm when we students and our teachers arrived. In our school, we weren't divided up by grades. You worked along at your own pace. In kindergarten, you did this stuff, and in first grade, when you moved up to first grade, you did this stuff, and then on up. And if you were an outstanding student, you might get to help teach the younger ones. We got a good basic education, and our teachers were always encouraging us to learn and to plan for a better life. Hold on a minute. Go. In the springtime, we kids always made whistles out of hickory limbs, and lots of us learned to ride our bikes on the Quarry baseball field. My father and my grandfather made slingshots for us, and we'd hunt rabbits and squirrels. We dug worms and made traps from screen wire to catch minnows for bait at Quarry Pond. There was a volleyball court out back of the post office, and a lot of us would gather there, mostly pickup games. We didn't have a lot of places to go, so everybody would just show up and play. The guard out at the Quarry Pond was a bit of a character. And I remember at Christmas time, some of us teenagers would go up to the Quarry Pond to shoot off firecrackers. Well, when the guard ran up there to see what was going on, some more of us down below would start shooting off firecrackers there. And he'd be running up and down and back and forth trying to catch us. A lot of our houses had front porches, and we'd sit out there in the evening and listen to the radio and wave to the neighbors walking by. The school auditorium/gymnasium was a community gathering place throughout the existence of Gantt's Quarry. In 1917, residents came there to see a play called The Noble Outcast. And the next year, we started watching movies, there on Saturday nights. The local PTA sponsored an old-fashioned fiddlers convention one year. They charged 25 cents for adults and 10 cents for the kids. I remember a fun play one of the church youth groups put on. It was called Bertie's Cave Woman, and it featured some fancy British tourists who went out west and got held up by outlaws. The play had plenty of shoot-'em-ups and a couple of singing cowboys. Gospel quartets like the Blackwood Brothers performed there, and a comedian from the Grand Ole Opry did a show most every year. There was always a Halloween festival with cakewalks and bingo, plus hot dogs and hamburgers dripping with a special sauce made by those lunchroom ladies. A 4-H club and a Boy Scout troop met at the school, too. Sports, especially baseball, were a big part of village life, with the Alabama Marble Company sponsoring a team from 1915 forward. On Saturdays, if there was a home game, that's where everybody was, over at the Ball Diamond. People even came from Sylacauga to watch the games. Just about every little country town in the South had a baseball team that some company sponsored. Oh, it was big time. Why, they could have held their own playing the New York Yankees, and every team member worked at the Quarry. For a long time, one of the company owners managed that team, and it was widely agreed that he hired some men more for their baseball skills than their quarry experience. If we had a friend who needed a job and had never worked in a quarry, We'd just tell him to tell the boss he knew a lot about baseball. After World War II, the Alabama Marble Company also sponsored the Gantt's Quarry Q, which was the official black baseball team at the Quarry. Many of these players had grown up playing pickup games as children. One newspaper described the Gantt's Quarry Q as, quote, the main nemesis, unquote, of the other African-American teams that they played, including the Titus Panthers from Elmore County and the Mignon Braves from Sylacauga. Spectators who attended ball games in Gantt's Quarry distinctly remember the delicious aroma of hot peanuts, fish frying, and barbecue that wafted through the stands. The Quarry had its own lighted tennis courts and a 9-hole golf course from the 1920s up into the mid-1960s. It was considered a good course back then, mostly flat, but it had a few hills. I caddied for a number of the men who played out there, and they paid me $1 for 9 holes and maybe a tip of 50 cents or another $1. Sometimes, if there weren't enough caddies, we'd carry 2 bags, but that got pretty tiresome after 18 holes. You see, they'd play the first 9 holes, and then they'd go back around and they'd play those 9 holes again. Now, sadly, village life was fading by the 1960s when Georgia Marble took over at the Quarry. Most everybody could drive to work by then, and Georgia Marble preferred to expand its quarry operations rather than support the village. By 1999, the W.P. Harrison House was the only standing evidence of a once vibrant village. A Birmingham News reporter described it as an oasis with green lawn and tall trees, but surrounded by mountains of rock and gaping gorges. There were derricks right up in the backyard by then. You know, they blocked us off at the highway now. They won't let us go out there because it's all dug up and there are holes everywhere. Yeah, seems like it happened overnight that they closed it off completely. My wife and I drove out there one day and we noticed this sign that said something like, "Don't come in here." But that sign was behind us when we noticed it. So I just laughed and I said to my wife, "Well, I can't read." And we kept on walking in among the ruins of Gantt's Quarry. Thank you.